Conservative leader Andrew Scheer is calling on the federal government to kick it up a notch. He says it's time for Canada to act now that 2 Canadian citizens are being detained in China. He also links those incidents to Canada's arrest of tech giant Huawei CFO Meng Wanzhou. Many have made that link. Meanwhile, Foreign Affairs Minister Chrystia Freeland is calling on Canada's, quote, partners not to politicize the extradition process. Would direct contact at the highest levels convince the Chinese to release the Canadian citizens? And what leverage does Canada really have if the American president uses it as a trade tactic? It's time for the Power Panel. In Toronto, former Saskatchewan Finance Minister Andrew Thompson, now Chief of Government Relations for University of Toronto. And here in studio with me, Rachel Curran, former Director of Policy to Stephen Harper and Senior Associate at Harper Associates, and the CBC's own David Cochrane. Unfortunately, we don't have a Liberal voice on the panel today because at the very last moment, we had a cancellation due to illness. We tried to prolong this as long as we could to try and get someone on the phone, but we've had no luck, so I apologize to our viewers for that. But we will hopefully keep this very not partisan today. So I'll start with you, Andrew. When we talk about what the role of the federal government is right now and what should be going on behind the scenes, what's your take?
I was pleased yesterday to see Minister Freeland's comments, which were much more moderated, temperate, starting to sound much more like a foreign minister than a trade negotiator in terms of her approach to this. I think obviously President Trump gravely undermined whatever case the Canadians have to say that this is a rule of law issue. And unfortunately, this is now starting to look like we're being played by the Americans as part of a trade dispute. So I think the minister is responding appropriately by starting to nuance the issue, de-escalate it, provide a bit more of an off-ramp for Canada in this discussion as they start to really understand exactly what the motives were behind the American extradition request.
Rachel, the minister is headed to Washington tomorrow along with Defense Minister Harper Associates. Is there any way to cut through the damage that President Trump did by saying that he's willing to intervene in this, essentially, as Andrew said, rendering our case that this is about the rule of law almost, you know, I don't know what.
Yeah, those comments were really unfortunate. So this was already a difficult situation, right? We were already stuck between the U.S. and China on this. And then to have the President of the United States say, oh, by the way, you know, we might be taking this person prisoner because it helps us secure a trade deal is just completely outrageous. And I think that changes the tenor of the U.S. request entirely. I think it changes the nature of our decision-making around that extradition request entirely. And the government's going to have to grapple with that going forward because ultimately the decision to surrender this individual to the U.S. is going to rest with the Minister of Justice, Jody Wilson-Raybould. So she's going to have a very difficult task in front of her, I think, as this case unfolds. But I think what Chrystia Freeland can do now is really go talk to the U.S. about what the motive, what the purpose behind this request really is. And I suspect she will be asking those very detailed questions. Look, do the president's comments actually reflect the U.S. views? There may be a fantastic criminal case here. There may be a fantastic criminal case against this individual. I have no doubt that there probably is. But his remarks have tainted the request in a way that she has now got to try and sort out with the Americans. So I think she has to try and get some kind of assurance that this request is totally legitimate, that there is no real credibility to the president's comments, and that there is a case here that we should take seriously. So I think she's going to be in the midst of some really difficult discussions with the U.S. on this.
And David, if there's anyone who knows something about extradition and how it works, Rachel brings up a really interesting point that ultimately the decision, and that decision is the one that we've heard about in the Chinese media, for example, whether or not to extradite Ms. Meng will rest in the hands of the government.
Yeah, I mean, look, the president has made things very difficult for Canada in what is the year of tourism for Canada and China, which I don't think is ending on a good note. But Donald Trump says a lot of things. I think we all know this, exhausting to follow it, and it doesn't make them true, and I think there's ample evidence of that. The arrest warrant for Meng, I believe, was issued by a judge in New York, and the New York courts have not exactly been an instrument of Donald Trump's policy in any way. So Rachel is right. This is almost certainly to end up in Jody Wilson-Raybould's desk, because the way this works, there's the legal process, and then there is the ministerial process in extradition. And we don't know all the evidence that's going to be presented against Meng, but we do know that statistically 90% of people who are arrested in this country for extradition by Canada are ultimately surrendered for extradition.
Oh, really?
This is why critics of the extradition laws in Canada say it is essentially a rubber stamp with a very low bar. When she goes before the extradition hearing judge, she will not be allowed to present evidence. She will not be allowed to call witnesses. It will simply be an assessment of the case the Americans present to the Department of Justice, and then the Department of Justice decides to bring it into court whether or not they feel it's worthy to pursue. So that process almost invariably leads back to the Minister of Justice. Now, what Trump has done, and people like Rob Curry will tell you this from the Dalhousie Law School, is that there is in extradition law a political offenses exception, that Canada will not extradite people who are seen as dissidents or caught up in a political war and being used for political purposes. Trump creates that argument now with what he's saying, that I will use her arrest in trade negotiations. So that doesn't happen in the extradition hearing phase. That happens in the ministerial review phase. And so all the language from Freeland on down is to make this very consular-driven, diplomatic, non-political. Ultimately, it's a political choice by the Minister of Justice, and the biggest politician in the world right now, the President, has really made that difficult.
So how do you, Andrew, how do you navigate that then if you're the federal government?
So I think there's two other issues that need to be taken into account with the extradition. The 90%, I mean, let's understand that that's a lot of cases where, you know, there really is a clear-cut comparison between the laws. First of all, in order to be extradited, you have to, from Canada, as I understand it, you have to be able to prove that you're guilty of a crime that would be punishable here in Canada.
Well, this is bank fraud. I mean, that's a crime in Canada,
so
right? And it has to be a crime in Canada and a sentence of at least 1 year.
Right, so if they can make this case, I mean, I think that's important, but we're not talking about, you know, most of these extradition things I think are largely around, you know, traditional criminal matters. Like you murder someone in the U.S. and you come to Canada, well, you're going to get shipped back to the U.S. But the question about the long reach of the American law is another question that I think needs to be addressed. We do not extradite people for violating the Cuban embargo or other laws that we don't really recognize in terms of the U.S. So there's always a political dimension to these kind of foreign affairs issues, and I think this is where the minister has trapped herself a little bit, with this constant bombardment of we're a rule of law country. That's true. We are a rule of law country, but there is, when we're dealing with foreign affairs issues, also a political dimension to that.
But didn't we have to make that? Didn't the government have to make that argument given China's position? You know, weren't they? What we were hearing was like, we have to say it's the rule of law because that's the way it works in this country, and because China thinks this is entirely like the politicians can entirely intervene because that's the way their system works.
Well, I don't think China's that naive. I think what they were hinting at, and unfortunately is kind of playing into their narrative, is that this seems now, whether it's true or not, seems to be politically motivated by the American president.
That's exactly the issue, right? I mean, of course China was going to say that. Unfortunately, Trump gave them the ammunition to say that with some credibility, which is so frustrating and so angry. Look, I am probably more supportive of our extradition laws than David is. I think it's a good thing that we have these bilateral extradition treaties, and that for 90% plus of cases, you know, countries are seeking the return of criminals and they want to prosecute those criminals, and we know they have fair rule of law systems, and we should be returning those people to our allies like the U.S. The problem is, in this case, the president actually introduced an additional dimension to this case, which suggests that the U.S. is asking for this arrest and extradition because they want to use Ms. Meng to conclude a trade deal, which is not something that we have ever engaged in, and we shouldn't be part of this.
You know, the question then is what does Canada do, right? Like Andrew Scheer says they need to raise this and escalate it. You're dealing with a country that has re-education camps for hundreds of thousands of its citizens. You can't match this with a reciprocal response. Like we can't suddenly start abducting Chinese citizens and withholding their consular rights. Economically,
I think the argument he was making was the Prime Minister should involve himself.
No, I understand that, but you can't sort of inflict the punishment on them that they are prepared to inflict on us. And at this point, would the Prime Minister even be able to do anything if you haven't even established consular contact with the people who are there? I mean, when do you bring the head of government into this as opposed to just dealing with your foreign affairs minister? I mean, Canada's in a very weak position here, stuck between the U.S. and China, and finding out, much like we did with NAFTA, just our place in the world in terms of our ability to exert economic and foreign policy influence.
But
Go ahead quickly, though, Andrew. Sorry, we got to go.
Most of these issues, though, are resolved through quiet diplomacy, and I think this is something that foreign affairs needs to remind itself of again. This is where we got into trouble in Saudi Arabia with this kind of moralizing about what was going on there, making it very loud. That's fine. I certainly agree with the position the government took, but These pieces we need to de-escalate. We don't need to ramp up so that the Prime Minister is directly inserted into it. Let's move it back down into a quiet diplomacy mode and see what can be worked through.
Okay, we are going to take a quick break, but we've got more Power Panel